A stranger showed up at Gideon Cross's door on the coldest morning of the year. No warning, no letter, no introduction. Just a young woman standing in the snow with wind-cracked lips and eyes that dared him to turn her away. "My mother said you needed a wife," she said. He stared at her. Behind her, the Montana sky sat low and gray, pressing down on the pines like a lid on a coffin. He hadn't spoken to another person in 11 days. He almost said no. He almost closed the door. If you've ever wondered what it takes to build a life out of nothing but stubbornness and borrowed time, stay with me. This story is going to take you somewhere real. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all started, Gideon Cross was doing what he did most mornings, losing a quiet argument with a fence post. The post had rotted through at the base. He'd known about it since September, meant to replace it before the ground froze. And then October came and went, and the ground froze anyway. And here he was in early December, kneeling in 6 inches of hard-packed snow with a pry bar that kept slipping, and fingers so cold he couldn't tell if he was gripping the iron or just imagining it. "Come on," he muttered, leaning his weight into the bar. The post made a sound like a gunshot and snapped clean off at the base, and the pry bar slammed sideways into his knee, and Gideon sat back in the snow and said nothing for a long moment, staring up at a sky the color of old pewter. He was 34 years old. His knee hurt. His fence was broken. He had half a cord of firewood left, and winter was maybe 3 months from letting go of the land, if he was lucky. He stood up, brushed snow off his canvas trousers, and carried the broken post toward the barn. That was when he heard the horse, not the usual sounds, not the elk that sometimes wandered down from the ridge, not the wind moving through the ponderosa pines that lined the north edge of his property. This was the deliberate, measured sound of a horse being ridden carefully, picking its way along the iced-over wagon road that curved around the base of the hill and led up to his front yard. Gideon set the post down and turned to look. The horse was a bay mare, older, ribs faintly visible even under her winter coat. She moved with the kind of cautious patience that came from carrying a rider who wasn't entirely confident, and the rider... He blinked. The rider was a young woman. She wore a coat that had been mended too many times in too many different places, the patches not quite matching each other in color or thickness. A wool scarf was wrapped twice around her throat and pulled up over the lower half of her face against the cold. Her hands, in thin leather gloves, held the reins with more determination than skill. She was watching the ground in front of the horse's feet, not him, until she cleared the tree line and looked up. She saw him standing there holding a rotted fence post. She pulled the mare to a stop. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved between them. Somewhere up on the ridge, a raven called once and went quiet. "Is this the Cross property?" she asked. Her voice was clear, a little rougher than he expected, like she'd been out in the cold for a while. "It is," Gideon said. She looked at him for another moment, something working behind her eyes. Calculation, or maybe just nerves she was working hard to hold down. Then she swung off the horse with less grace than she probably would have liked, stumbled slightly as her boots hit the frozen ground, caught herself on the stirrup without making a sound about it, and walked toward him with the reins in her hand. She stopped about 6 feet away and looked him over in a direct, unsentimental way, like she was trying to determine the load-bearing capacity of a structure she wasn't sure she trusted. "My mother said you needed a wife," she said. Gideon Cross had been surprised exactly twice in his adult life. Once when his first horse survived a rattlesnake bite that should have killed her. Once when his wife, Clara, told him she was dying and said it in the same tone she used to talk about the weather. This was the third time. He stared at the young woman standing in the snow in her mismatched coat, and he had no idea at all what to say. Her name was Eliza Rowan. She told him that after he'd stood there long enough that the silence started to get embarrassing for both of them. "Eliza Rowan," she said, with the tone of someone who'd already decided she wasn't going to apologize for being there. "My mother is Margaret Rowan. She took in laundry for your neighbor, Hector Finch, for about 3 years. He mentioned, according to her, that you'd been talking about maybe needing help with the property, someone to share the work." "Hector Finch talks too much," Gideon said. "That's probably accurate." She wasn't smiling, exactly. There was something at the corner of her mouth that could have been the beginning of one, but she kept it there, contained. "My mother heard and sent me here. Without..." He stopped. "Does she know you're here right now, specifically?" "She sent me," That's not the same thing. The corner of her mouth moved again fractionally. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at her horse. The mare had dropped her head and was nosing at the snow, looking for grass that wasn't there. She'd been ridden hard to get here, not brutally, but steadily. The ride from town was about 9 miles on the main road. In this cold, that was 2 hours minimum. Come inside, he said, because he didn't know what else to say, and the wind had picked up, and the temperature was dropping, and whatever this was, it didn't need to be conducted in the snow. I'll put your horse in the barn. She handed over the reins without argument. He noticed she checked the mare's near foreleg before she let go, a quick, practiced brush of her hand down the horse's leg, feeling for heat or swelling. It was a thing a person did if they knew horses, or if they'd been responsible for one for long enough that it had become instinct. He put the mare in the barn with his own 2 horses and a scoop of oats she didn't deserve based on the condition she was in, but he gave them anyway. Then he went inside. Eliza Rowan was standing in the middle of his main room when he came in, not sitting, looking around with the same calibrating expression she'd turned on him outside. He watched her eyes move across the room, the low fire, the dishes stacked without quite being washed, the stack of financial ledgers on the table that he'd been meaning to sort through since October and hadn't, the chair with the broken arm he'd propped against the wall and forgotten about, the window with the cracked panes stuffed with rags against the draft. She didn't say anything about any of it. Sit down, he said, moving to the stove to pour coffee. You want coffee? Please. He poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from her. She sat, wrapped both hands around the tin cup, and looked at him across the table with an expression that was hard to read. Steady, watchful, but not unkind. I should be clear about some things, she said. I'd appreciate that. My family owes money. My father died 2 years ago and left debts we didn't know about until after, and we've been working down what we owe ever since. My mother takes in laundry and sewing. My younger brother works at the mill. We've sold almost everything we had. She said it without drama, without any of the wavering that might have made it easier to dismiss. Just facts, laid flat on the table between them. I came here because my mother thought it was a solution. I came because I didn't have a better idea. Gideon wrapped his own hands around his cup and looked at her. She was maybe 23, 24, dark hair pulled back practically, a small scar above her left eyebrow, pale against her skin. She was cold. He could see it in the set of her jaw. But she wasn't shaking. You could have any number of objections to this, she continued, and I'd understand them all. But I can work. I know how to keep accounts. My father taught me when I was young. I know how to preserve food, manage a household, handle animals. I learn quickly, and I don't complain about things that aren't worth complaining about. She paused. I'm not going to pretend I came here because I want to marry a stranger. I came because it seemed like a better option than the ones I had. He nodded slowly. What do you know about this property? He asked. She considered. Hector Finch said you have about 320 acres, creek running through the south quarter. Good soil, apparently, but you've been working it alone since your wife passed. 1.5 years, 2 years ago? 2 years, he said. February. I'm sorry, she said, and she sounded like she meant it, without making it into more than it was. He looked out the cracked window at the snow coming down now in steady, unhurried flakes, covering the broken fence post he'd left in the yard. He thought about the ledgers on the table. He thought about the 3 fields he'd failed to plant in the south quarter because he ran out of time in spring and there was no one to work them with him. He thought about the winter he'd spent in this house alone, with no sound but the fire and the wind, talking to his horses sometimes just to hear his own voice make words. He was not a man who liked to admit need. He'd spent most of his life treating need as something close to weakness, and it had cost him, probably more than he'd ever fully accounted for. Here's what I can offer, he said. This house. A room of your own. It's small, used to be storage, but it's dry and it'll be warm. Equal say in how the ranch is run. I'll take your name off your family's debt as part of the arrangement. I'll pay what remains. He watched her face carefully when he said that. She went very still. This isn't charity. I need the help and I can afford it, barely. That makes it a trade. How much is left? She asked quietly. He shook his head. Doesn't matter. That's what I'm offering. Her jaw worked slightly. She looked down at her coffee cup. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright but dry, and he respected her for it, the effort of holding that down. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. I don't. What if I turn out to be completely wrong for this? What if I do? She blinked, like she hadn't expected him to say that. I've been wrong about plenty of things, he said. My fence, for one. I should have fixed it in September. He looked at her evenly. We'd figure it out if it didn't work. No one needs to be trapped in anything. She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Snow tapped at the window glass. When? She asked. Soon, before the passes close, if possible. There's a circuit judge comes through Harlan every 3 weeks. I know Reverend Tate in town does civil ceremonies, she said. Quicker. He hadn't known that. He nodded. Give me 2 days to go back and settle things with my mother, she said, and to pack what I have. She looked at him with the same level directness she'd maintained through the entire conversation. I'll come back. All right, he said. She finished her coffee, set the cup down exactly in the center of a faint ring on the table, and stood up. He walked her back out to the barn, saddled the mare, checked the cinch himself when she wasn't looking, and found she'd already checked it and tightened it correctly. She rode out down the wagon road without looking back. He stood in the barn door and watched her go until the tree line took her, and then he went inside and sat at the table and looked at the ledgers and the dirty dishes and the rag-stuffed window. He thought, I might have just done something extremely stupid, he thought, or I might have just done the only sensible thing I've done in 2 years. He didn't know which. He poured himself more coffee and went back to work. She came back in exactly 2 days. It was mid-morning, the sky low and white, threatening snow that hadn't come yet. Gideon was in the barn mending a harness when he heard the wagon, and when he came out he saw not just Eliza and the bay mare, but a small buckboard driven by a boy of maybe 15 with Margaret Rowan's round, tired face and Eliza's same set to the jaw. The wagon had 3 trunks and a crate of books. My brother Thomas, Eliza said, climbing down. She was wearing different clothes, the same mended coat, but cleaner. Her hair was done more carefully than before. Not that it appeared to have taken her much thought. He drove the wagon. He'll take it back. Thomas Rowan looked at Gideon with a flat, assessing stare that was impressively hostile for a 15-year-old. Gideon looked back at him without flinching. You'll take care of her, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. I intend to, Gideon said. Thomas held the stare for another 3 seconds, then nodded, satisfied, or at least decided, and started unhitching the mare from the traces. Eliza watched this exchange with the expression of someone very carefully not finding it funny. The books are non-negotiable, she said to Gideon. I didn't say anything about the books. You were looking at the crate. I was, he admitted. What's in there? Accounting texts, a few histories, 2 novels that aren't appropriate for me to own according to my mother, which is exactly why I'm keeping them. She picked up the smallest trunk herself and looked at him. Are we doing this today? They did it that afternoon. Reverend Tate in Harlan was a compact, businesslike man who did not embellish. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Thomas stood against the wall with his arms crossed, looking like he was attending a funeral. Afterward, he shook Gideon's hand with a grip that suggested he'd been practicing, hugged his sister for a long time, and drove the wagon back toward town without looking back, which told Gideon that the boy was probably crying and didn't want anyone to see it. Eliza watched him go. She was quiet for the ride back to the ranch. When they pulled into the yard, she looked at the house, the barn, the frozen field stretching south toward the tree line, the broken fence post still lying where Gideon had left it because he'd gotten distracted by her showing up and hadn't dealt with it. I'll fix that tomorrow, he said, nodding at the post. I'll help, she said. They went inside. The first week was strange in the way that only 2 people who don't know each other being forced into close proximity can be strange. Not bad exactly, just full of the small, awkward edges of figuring out how to exist in the same space. Eliza woke up before he did, which surprised him. He'd always been an early riser. Winter or summer, he was up before full light, getting the fire stoked and the animals fed. The 3rd morning, he came downstairs to find the fire already rebuilt, coffee already on, and Eliza at the table with the stack of ledgers he'd been avoiding for months, frowning at them with a pencil in her hand. Did you know, she said without looking up, that you've been double paying on the seed account with Margolis Brothers since March? He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. What? Look. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. You paid in March when the invoice came in. Then again in June when Margolis sent a second bill, which he apparently sent because he lost his records from spring and assumed you hadn't paid, and you paid it, both times. He looked at the numbers. She was right. That's, he started. $14, she said. You're owed $14 from Margolis Brothers, and that's just the first thing I found. She turned the ledger back and kept reading. He sat down across from her with his coffee and watched her work. She read with the focused, almost physical attention of someone for whom information was a resource, something to be extracted and used. She ran a finger along the columns, lips moving slightly, and when she found something, she wrote a small note in the margin in a handwriting that was smaller and neater than he expected. How long is this going to take? He asked. To go through all of these? She glanced at the stack. 3 days, maybe, depending on how bad they get. They got bad. By the end of the week, she had a full accounting of what he owed, what he was owed, where the money had gone wrong, and 2 pages of notes in her small, precise hand about ways the ranch was bleeding money it didn't need to lose. She showed him everything, explained her reasoning for all of it, and waited for him to push back or dismiss something. He didn't, because she was right about all of it. My father, she said, near the end of the 3rd day of this, when they were eating supper and she had the notes spread out next to her plate, used to say that most problems that look like land problems or weather problems are actually money problems wearing a different coat. He was probably right. He usually was. She was quiet a moment. He was just better at understanding money than managing it, which is a particular kind of painful way to be. It was the most personal thing she'd said to him since she'd arrived. He didn't push at it. He just filed it away. By the end of the 2nd week, they'd established something like a working routine. Gideon handled the animals, the structures, anything that needed muscle and tools. Eliza managed the household accounts, the food stores, the planning for spring, but the lines weren't clean. She was outside with him most mornings, not because he asked her to be, but because she wanted to understand what she was planning for. Show me how you work out what the fields need, she said one afternoon when they were walking the south quarter, checking where the snow had drifted and where the soil underneath might be compromised. You want to know about soil management in the middle of December. I want to know everything in December so I'm not learning it in April when we need to be planting, she said, with the practical logic of someone who had thought about it. Show me. So he showed her. He walked her through the south quarter and told her what he knew about the soil, what had grown there before and how, where the water ran in spring and where it pooled badly and why. She asked questions, good ones, the kind that came from actually paying attention rather than just being polite. She also asked about Clara, once, carefully. They were repairing the fence together, she holding the new post in position while he tamped frozen soil around the base. And she said, without particular weight, your wife, was she from here originally or did she come out with you? She came with me, he said. We came out from Ohio together. She was 20 when we made the trip. She sounds brave. She was. Braver than me in most ways. He kept tamping. She got sick winter before last. Lung fever. Went fast in the end. 3 weeks, start to finish. Eliza held the post steady. Were you with her? The whole time. Good, she said quietly. It was a strange comfort, that. He hadn't expected it to be, but it was. 3 weeks after Eliza arrived, Gideon rode into Harlan for supplies, and he heard the name Victor Harrow for the first time. He'd heard of Harrow before. Everyone in the territory had. Mining baron, owned significant claims up in the mountains to the northwest, had money enough to buy half the county if he took the notion. But Harrow had never paid particular attention to this corner of the valley before, as far as Gideon knew. He was at the general store loading bags of flour into the wagon when Ed Peltzer, who ran the store and made it his business to know everything that happened within 30 miles, leaned on the counter and said, You heard Harrow's men were out your direction last week? Gideon looked up. No. 2 of them, riding the creek line down through the south quarter of the valley. Ed kept his voice casual, the way people in small towns keep their voice casual when they're actually extremely interested in what they're saying. Word is Harrow's got surveyors coming in spring, wants to assess the creek for a placer operation. The creek. Gideon's mind went immediately to the creek that ran through the south end of his property. The same creek he'd walked with Eliza. The one he'd shown her where the water pooled wrong and where the soil was best in spring. It wasn't a big creek, but it ran cold and clear year-round, fed by snowmelt from the high ridge, and it was the reason the south quarter was the best land on the property. "He can want whatever he likes," Gideon said. Ed gave him a look. "Harrow generally gets what he wants, is the thing." "Not from me." Gideon finished loading the flour and tipped his hat. "Thanks, Ed." He drove home with the weight of that information sitting low in his chest, the way bad news always did. Not sharp, not immediate, just heavy, settling in. When he got back to the ranch, Eliza was in the kitchen working through a crate of canning jars, checking the seals on the preserved food, making notes. He came in, set down the flour, and stood at the door for a moment, not saying anything. She looked up, read his face in the efficient way she'd started to do. "What happened?" she said. He told her about Victor Harrow. She listened without interrupting, her hand still on the jar she'd been checking, her eyes on him. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "He doesn't have any legal claim to the creek," she said. "Not that I know of." "What's your original property filing say about the water rights?" He looked at her. "I'd have to find the paperwork." "Let's find the paperwork," she said, and stood up. They spent the evening going through the box of documents he kept under the floorboard in the back room. Deeds, correspondence, filings, all of it. Eliza sorted through it with her characteristic focused efficiency, reading each piece before she set it aside or kept it. She found the water rights documentation near the bottom, spread it on the table, and read it twice. "The creek is yours," she said. "All of it, from the north property line to the south. Water rights explicitly included in the original homestead filing." She looked up at him. "Victor Harrow has no legal basis for any claim on it." "He doesn't need a legal basis if he has enough money to create one that looks real," Gideon said. She considered that. "No," she said. "He doesn't." Her expression hadn't changed exactly, but something in it had sharpened. "Then we'd better make sure we know exactly what our documentation says before he shows us his." December deepened. The temperature dropped to places it had no reasonable business being, and the ranch contracted around the cold the way living things do, drawing in, conserving, enduring. Gideon found himself noticing things. The way Eliza moved through cold mornings with brisk, economical efficiency, no wasted motion, no complaint about temperatures that would have made him miserable to listen to anyone complain about. The way she talked to the horses with the same matter-of-fact directness she used on everything else. Like they were colleagues she expected to be reasonable. The way she had a habit, when she was thinking hard about something, of pressing the end of her pencil against her lower lip and going very still. Like whatever was happening inside her head required all available stillness from her body. He noticed that she ate less than she should have, and understood without asking that this was a habit built from years of there not being enough to go around, and made sure the portions were larger without making it obvious. She noticed. "You don't have to do that," she said one evening, looking at her plate. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. She looked at him. He kept eating. After a moment she did too, and they didn't discuss it. One evening, near the end of the month, the wind so loud against the north wall that conversation required a raised voice. She was reading one of her novels at the fire, one of the inappropriate ones, from the way she'd positioned the cover away from where he was sitting, and he was working on the harness buckle that had been giving him trouble, and he said without quite planning to, "Are you sorry you came?" She looked up from the book. The firelight moved across her face. "No," she said. Not immediately, not defensively. She actually considered the question before answering. "There are things I miss. My brother. Having choices that are mine." She paused, looking at him with her characteristic frankness. "But I don't regret the decision. This is honest work and honest company, and that's more than I expected." He nodded and went back to the buckle. "Are you?" she asked. "Sorry I came?" He thought about the ledgers, fixed, about the fence post, replaced, about walking the south quarter with someone beside him explaining what he'd learned about the land over years of working it, about having a reason to cook a full supper instead of just eating bread and salt pork and calling it done. "No," he said. She went back to her book. The fire held. The wind pressed at the walls and found them solid. Outside, the temperature continued to fall, and the snow lay deep and still across the fields, and in the barn the horses were warm and fed. It wasn't happiness, exactly. Neither of them would have called it that, and both of them would have been suspicious of anyone who moved that fast toward a word like that. But it was something. It was warmth where there had been cold. It was two voices in a house that had held only one. It was, against all reasonable expectation, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them was ready to name. The winter had more to say, though. The winter always did. And in the hills to the northwest, in a well-heated office paneled in dark wood, a man named Victor Harrow was looking at a map of the valley and drawing a slow, deliberate circle around the stretch of creek that ran through the south quarter of the Cross Ranch. He had not forgotten about it. He was not the kind of man who forgot about things worth wanting, and patience, when the prize was large enough, had never cost him anything he wasn't willing to pay. January came in hard, not the kind of hard that announces itself with drama, no blizzard, no sudden catastrophe, just a slow, grinding cold that settled into everything and refused to leave. The kind of cold that got into the joints of the house, into the wood of the barn walls, into the fingers of anyone foolish enough to work outside without 2 pairs of gloves. The kind that wore at a person not by force, but by persistence. Gideon had lived through enough Montana winters to respect that kind more than the dramatic kind. You could brace against a blizzard. You couldn't brace against 6 weeks of relentless, patient cold. They fell into the work the way water finds a channel, not planned, just following the shape of what needed doing. Mornings started dark and stayed that way until well past 7. Gideon handled the animals first, always. Horses, the 2 pigs in the south pen, the chickens that spent most of January deeply unhappy about their circumstances. Eliza kept the fire, managed breakfast, and was usually in the middle of something useful by the time he came back in stomping snow off his boots. She had reorganized the food stores in the first week of January. Didn't ask, just did it. Moved things around in the root cellar according to a logic he hadn't thought of, but immediately understood was better than what he'd had before. Preservation order. Most perishable nearest the door, most stable deepest in. She'd labeled everything in her small, neat handwriting on strips of cloth tacked above each shelf. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, standing in the root cellar doorway looking at it. "I know," she said, from the back where she was stacking the last of the potato crates. "But now we know exactly what we have and exactly how long it'll last, and that's worth 2 hours of moving things around." He didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. What he was less prepared for was the way she asked questions. Not constant. Eliza was not a woman who filled silence for its own sake, but when she asked something, it was always a thing she actually wanted to know. She asked about the soil composition in the east field versus the south quarter. She asked about the creek's behavior in spring thaw, how high it ran, how long before it settled. She asked about the roof of the barn, which section had been repaired most recently, and what material he'd used. She was building a picture of the property in her head, he realized, cataloging it the same way she'd cataloged the food stores. And once she had the full picture, she would find the inefficiencies, the way she'd found the double payment to Margolis Brothers. It should have made him uneasy, maybe, someone learning the details of everything he'd built, everything he'd struggled to hold on to. But it didn't. It felt strangely like having a second pair of eyes on something you'd been squinting at alone for so long you'd stopped seeing it clearly. The letter from Victor Harrow arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January, carried by a rider Gideon didn't recognize. A young man in a good coat who handed over the envelope without making eye contact and left before Gideon could ask him anything. He brought it inside. Eliza looked up from the account she was working on, read his expression, and set her pencil down. He opened it at the table and read it, and then he passed it to her without saying anything. It was written in formal, lawyer-polished language that managed to be perfectly civil and perfectly threatening at the same time. It referenced a legal survey, apparently completed the previous autumn, which had identified a discrepancy in the original boundary filing for the Cross property. The letter suggested, with great cordiality, that the creek currently believed to be within the Cross property line might in fact fall partially, perhaps entirely, outside it. Victor Harrow, as a man of community standing and goodwill, was prepared to discuss the matter with Mr. Cross at a mutually convenient time, with the intent of reaching an arrangement beneficial to both parties. Eliza read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table and looked at it with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that meant she was doing something fast and complicated in her head that she'd explain in a moment. "This is fabricated," she said. "Probably," he said. "Can you prove that?" "Not yet." She picks up the letter again. But look at this. It doesn't cite a specific survey date, doesn't name the surveyor, doesn't reference any filing number. If there were an actual legal survey with a real discrepancy, this letter would lead with that information. It would have to. Instead, it says, a survey has identified, which means nothing without documentation behind it. She set the letter down again. He's testing you, seeing if you'll panic and come to the table before he has anything real to show. Gideon looked at her. You got all that from one read. I got it from the second read, she said. The first read I was just angry. He almost smiled. What do you think we should do? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the north ridge. That sound like distant water that Gideon had listened to for so many years, it had become part of his thinking. Right back, she said. Formally. Request the specific documentation, survey date, surveyor name, filing number. Make him produce something real before you treat it as real. She looked at him. If he has it, we need to see it. If he doesn't have it, making him produce it slows him down and tells you what you're actually dealing with. You want to poke him. I want to know what he's holding, she said. There's a difference. They wrote the letter together that evening. Or rather, Eliza drafted it, and Gideon read it and made one change, taking out a line he felt was too accommodating in tone, and she agreed without argument that he was right. She had a good instinct for when to push and when to yield, including in arguments about the arguments themselves. The reply went out the next morning. 3 days later, they heard the first rumor. It came from Thomas, Eliza's brother, who rode out on his day off from the mill with his collar turned up against the cold, and a look on his face that said he'd been thinking about what he was carrying for most of the ride out. He was 16 now, filling out through the shoulders, working hard to seem older than he was, and occasionally succeeding. Eliza made him coffee, and he sat at the table and didn't drink it, just wrapped his hands around the cup and said, People in town are saying Harrow's lawyer has documents showing the creek doesn't belong to you. What people? Gideon asked. Mill foreman said it. His wife told my mother. Thomas looked at Gideon steadily. Gideon, the foreman doesn't have opinions about property law for no reason. Somebody told him to say it. I know, Gideon said. Thomas looked at his sister. Is it true? About the creek? No, Eliza said without hesitation. We have the original filing. The water rights are explicit. Whatever documents Harrow claims to have, they're either fabricated or they're going to need significant legal work to hold up, and we're going to be watching every step of that process. Thomas absorbed this. He was quiet in the way of someone deciding whether to believe something. Not because they doubted the speaker, but because believing it meant carrying the weight of it. Mama's worried, he said finally. I know she is. Eliza's voice was even. Tell her not to be. Not yet. After Thomas left, Gideon stood at the window and watched the boy ride back down the wagon road, smaller and smaller against the white landscape until the tree line took him. He's a good kid, he said. He's been the man of the family for 2 years, Eliza said from behind him. He's tired. Gideon turned. She was collecting the coffee cups, moving with that economical efficiency she always had, but there was something different in the set of her shoulders. Attention she was holding very carefully. Eliza. She stopped and looked at him. We're not losing the creek, he said. She looked at him for a moment, not with relief. She wasn't someone who leaned on reassurance, but something in her shoulders changed anyway, fractionally. I know, she said. I just need to find the thread that unravels his claim before he can build it any further. She set the cups down and picked up her pencil. I'm going to write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Request a copy of every filing on record for this section. Whatever Harrow is going to produce, I want to see the original documents before his version of them. It was exactly the right thing to do. Gideon nodded and left her to it. The weeks that followed had a quality he could only describe later as watchful. The work continued. It had to. The ranch didn't pause for anxiety. But underneath the daily business of keeping the place running, something was building. Harrow's name came up in town more frequently now. Men who'd been neutral found reasons to mention him, his influence, the reach of his money. A merchant on the main street of Harlan, who'd always greeted Gideon warmly, turned slightly formal, slightly careful. Another rancher in the valley, a man named Pruitt, who ran cattle on the north side of the ridge, stopped Gideon on the road one afternoon and said, low and fast like he was worried about being seen talking, "He's been to see Calloway." Calloway was the county's largest landowner, the man most people in the valley deferred to when disputes arose. If Harrow was cultivating Calloway's opinion, he was working to isolate Gideon before the formal pressure began. "When?" Gideon asked. "Last week. Rode up there himself, spent 2 hours. Pruitt looked uncomfortable, the look of a man who'd rather not be involved but feels a residual sense of decency pulling at him. "I don't know what was said, but Calloway's been quiet since, and that's not like him." Gideon thanked him and drove home. That evening, he told Eliza what Pruitt had said. She was at the table writing the letter to the Helena Land Office, which had turned into a longer document than she'd originally planned, full of careful, specific legal language her father had taught her, and she'd been polishing for 3 days. She stopped writing and looked at the wall above the fireplace for a moment. "He's doing it carefully," she said. "Harrow. He's not coming at us directly yet. He's cutting off the exits first, making sure that when he does apply real pressure, there's nowhere for you to go." She looked at Gideon. "He's done this before." "Almost certainly," Gideon said. "To who?" "I can think of 2 families who sold up and left in the last 3 years. The Albrights, north of here. The Mercer family over by the river. Both left quickly." He looked at the fire. "I always assumed it was just hardship. The land." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it wasn't just the land." She turned back to her letter and wrote 2 more lines, then stopped again. "Gideon, I need you to understand something." Her tone made him look at her fully. "He can make this very bad," she said. "Even without real legal standing, a man with his money can tie up this property in dispute long enough that you can't do anything with it, can't borrow against it, can't sell it, can't farm it productively if the uncertainty's hanging over everything. He might not need to actually win. He might just need to make the fight expensive enough that holding on stops making sense." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying we can't fight it. I'm saying we need to understand what we're actually up against." He looked at her for a moment. The dark circles she'd developed under her eyes from late nights with the ledgers and the documents, the ink stain on her right hand that never quite washed off anymore, the slight tension in her jaw that was there most of the time now when she wasn't actively doing something with her hands. "Are you telling me we should consider selling?" he said. "No." Her voice was flat and certain. "I'm telling you we should go in clear-eyed, not because the situation is comfortable." She picked up her pencil again. "I haven't come this far to hand anything to a man like Victor Harrow." It was the most proprietary thing she'd said about the ranch since she arrived. This far. Like the ground she'd covered to get here was already hers. Already something she'd paid into with enough of herself that surrendering it was not a category of option she was entertaining. Gideon felt something settle in his chest. Not ease, exactly. The situation was not easy and getting less easy by the week. But something solid. Like a beam being placed correctly, load-bearing, the kind that meant the structure would hold. "All right," he said. "Then we fight it." She sent the letter to Helena 2 days later, with a rider she paid out of her own careful savings from the household account. The land office would take time to respond, weeks, possibly longer. And in the meantime, the property sat under its quiet siege, and Gideon and Eliza worked, and the cold pressed in from all sides, patient as the kind of enemy that knows it can afford to wait. February came. The temperature dropped another notch, which seemed impossible but was Montana, so wasn't. The horses grew sullen and needed extra feed. One of the pigs got sick, and Gideon spent 2 days nursing it with a stubbornness that Eliza, watching from the doorway of the south pen, recognized as something more than practical concern. "You've had that pig a long time?" she asked. 6 years, he said, not looking up from where he was crouched checking the animal's breathing. She didn't say anything else. She just went and got the warm water he needed before he asked for it. The pig lived. Victor Harrow's second letter arrived in the 3rd week of February, and this one was less cordial. It referenced for the first time specific legal action, a filing in territorial court to establish the boundary dispute as a matter of formal record. It gave Gideon 60 days to respond through legal counsel, or the filing would proceed unopposed. Eliza read it standing up, still in her coat from having just come in from the barn. She read it once, set it on the table, and turned to hang up her coat, and Gideon watched her and said nothing until she was ready. "He's escalating," she said, her back still to him. "Yes." She turned around. Her face was calm, but her eyes had that sharpness in them that appeared when she was angry and holding it very carefully. "We need to find someone in Harlan who practices property law," she said, "or get a letter to Helena to someone who does. Not because we need them to fight this for us, but because we need to understand exactly what standing he has to make this filing. And we need our documentation in order when this goes in front of any one official." "There's a lawyer in Harlan," Gideon said. "Cable Warren. I don't know him well. Find out what you can about him," she said. "I'll have everything we have organized and summarized before you go." She was at the table with the documents before he'd finished pouring the day's last cup of coffee. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the north wall, that low, grinding February wind that had no interest in whatever humans were doing inside their small, warm houses. The wind that had been moving across this high country long before any of them arrived and would be moving across it long after. Gideon sat down across from her and watched her work, and he thought about the creek running somewhere under its skin of ice, patient and cold, still running regardless. The way things that mattered kept running regardless. He thought, "We are not losing this land. Not as a declaration, not even as a decision." Just as a fact, he found himself believing with a quietness that surprised him, like something that had been settling in him for weeks and had now, finally, come to rest. He pulled one of the ledgers toward him and opened it, and they worked side by side until the fire burned low, and neither of them spoke much, and neither of them needed to. What neither of them knew, in that quiet house on that February night, was that 60 miles away in the warmth of Victor Harrow's office, a man named Dole was collecting something from a table, something metal that caught the lamplight, and being given instructions that had nothing to do with courtrooms or legal filings. The front door was not the only way into a man's life. Harrow understood that better than most, and he had decided that Gideon Cross had been politely uncooperative for long enough. The smell reached Gideon first. He was asleep, actually asleep, which had become a rarer thing as February wore on and the anxiety of the legal situation worked its way into the hours that used to belong to rest. But that night he'd gone down hard, the kind of sleep that comes from physical exhaustion finally winning its argument with a worried mind, and he was deep in it when the smell pulled him up. Smoke. Not the familiar domestic smell of the house fire burning low. Something different. Sharper. The smell of something burning that was not meant to burn. He was out of bed and at the window before he was fully awake, and what he saw turned his stomach to ice. The hay barn was on fire. Not smoldering, burning. The whole north wall was lit from inside, orange light pushing through the gaps in the boards. And even as he watched, a section of the roof caught, and the fire made that sound. That specific, terrible sound of fire finding new material and deciding to keep going. He was already moving, already pulling on his boots, when he heard Eliza's door open and her feet on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway of his room, still in her nightclothes, with her coat thrown over her shoulders, and she took one look at his face and then looked past him at the window. "The horses," she said immediately. "Barn's clear. They're in the main barn." He was already moving past her toward the stairs. "Get dressed. Get the water buckets from the kitchen." "How many?" "All of them." The cold outside hit like a wall. Gideon ran across the yard toward the hay barn with his heart hammering and the snow brutal under his boots, and the fire already loud. Already loud in the way that meant it had been burning for a while before the smell woke him. Eliza was behind him inside a minute, dressed in whatever she'd grabbed first, her hair loose, carrying 4 buckets stacked inside each other. She'd already filled 2 of them from the kitchen barrel, sloshing water in the snow as she ran. He took 2 and they worked, back and forth to the creek, the ice broken where they'd been drawing water all winter, hauling and throwing and hauling again in the bitter cold while the fire took what it wanted and gave back nothing. They couldn't save the barn. They understood that within the first 10 minutes. What they could do was keep it from spreading to the main barn, to the tool shed, to the house itself. And that was what they did, working until Gideon's arms stopped hurting and went numb, and then started hurting again in a different way. And Eliza's face was red and streaming from the heat on one side and the cold on the other, and neither of them said a single unnecessary word. The barn collapsed inward around 3 in the morning. The sound of it was enormous in the winter quiet, and then the fire settled lower, feeding on what was left, and they stood back and watched it burn down to something manageable. Gideon's lungs ached. His hands were shaking. He couldn't tell if it was cold or rage, or just the aftermath of that much adrenaline with nowhere left to go. Eliza was standing beside him, still breathing hard, a bucket hanging from each hand. There was a burn on her left forearm where an ember had caught her, a red stripe about 3 inches long that she hadn't mentioned and wasn't mentioning now. "Your arm," he said. She looked at it like she'd forgotten it was there. "It's not deep." "Come inside and let me look at it." She didn't argue. That told him something about how tired she was. Inside, in the lamplight, the burn was angrier than it had looked in the dark, but she was right that it wasn't deep. He cleaned it and wrapped it, and she sat still for the whole process without complaint, though the muscle in her jaw worked once when he pressed the cloth against it. "How much hay was in there?" she asked, while he was tying off the bandage. "Enough to last us through March," he said. "Maybe into April." She absorbed that. They both knew what it meant. Without that hay, the horses would need supplemental feed he'd have to buy in Harlan, at whatever price the merchants decided to charge a man who clearly needed it badly. The pigs would need more grain. Every day from now until the spring grass came in would cost more than it had cost yesterday. "We have enough money to cover it?" she asked. "Barely. I'll find a way to make it barely enough," she said. Not a performance of confidence, just a statement of intent from someone who had already rearranged more with less. He looked at her across the table. The burn on her arm, the soot on her face and hands, the loose hair she hadn't bothered to fix. She looked exhausted and capable, and he was struck, not for the first time, by how little she looked like the woman who'd stood in his yard in her mended coat and announced that her mother said he needed a wife. That woman had been a stranger. This one was something else. He didn't have a clean word for what. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said, before he finished. Her eyes were on the table. It wasn't an accident. He hadn't said that. He'd been thinking it with the kind of cold certainty that he'd been trying to reason himself out of since the moment they'd stood watching the barn burn, but he hadn't said it. "The hay was damp on the north side," he said quietly. "I checked it 2 weeks ago. It shouldn't have caught that fast." "It didn't catch," she said. "It was started." She looked up at him. "I'm going to go look at what's left in the morning, when it's light, before anything gets disturbed. It's going to be a mess out there." "I know. That's why I want to look before it gets any more disturbed than it already is." She did it at first light, while Gideon was doing the animal chores. He came back in to find her gone, the house empty, and went back out and found her at the edge of the collapsed barn in the gray morning light, crouching in the snow and ash and burned timber, not touching anything, just looking. He crouched beside her. She pointed without speaking. In the snow around the north wall, the wall that had gone up first, the wall where the fire had clearly started, there was a pattern of dark spots in the snow. The heat of the fire had melted the area closest to the barn, but further out, where the ground was still intact, the dark spots were clear, small, circular. "Lamp oil," she said. He looked at them. His jaw tightened. "They dripped it," she said, "coming along the wall. Or they were careless, which means they didn't expect anyone to look." She stood up slowly, scanning the snow around the perimeter. She walked carefully along the north side of the structure, reading the ground. He followed. Around the back corner of the barn, in a depression where the snow had drifted, she stopped. There were boot prints. 2 sets going in, 1 set going out, both from the same direction, from the south, coming along the tree line that ran parallel to the fence. The person had come through the trees rather than across the open yard. They'd known where the barn was relative to the house. They'd been careful about not being seen from the main windows. "They knew the layout of the property," Gideon said. "Yes." Eliza was crouching again, looking at the print without touching it. The boot was large, wider than average, and there was something distinctive about the heel, a worn-down edge on the inside that made the impression uneven. Someone who'd been here before, or who'd been watching long enough to learn it. She stood up and looked at the tree line, and Gideon watched her face in the cold morning light, and what he saw there was not fear. It was something colder and more purposeful than fear. It was the look of someone taking a measurement of an enemy. "We need to tell the sheriff," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, and there was something careful in how she said it. "We do. But let me write down exactly what we're looking at first. Every detail. Because once we report this, other people will be here, and things will get moved, and I want us to have our own record of what this looked like before that happens. She went inside and came back with paper and her pencil and spent 40 minutes documenting everything. The location of the oil spots, the boot prints, the approach route, the point where the fire had clearly originated. She drew a rough diagram of the north wall with the spots marked relative to each other. She measured the distance between the prints using the length of her own stride as reference. Gideon watched her and felt the particular discomfort of a man who is capable and experienced in most relevant areas, discovering that someone else is better at the specific thing that matters most right now. He did not resent it. He had learned, more slowly than he'd have liked to admit, that being the best at everything was a fantasy that lonely men told themselves. They rode to Harlan that afternoon. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who had held the position for 9 years and operated with the particular caution of someone who had survived in the job by never moving faster than he absolutely had to. He listened to Gideon's account with his elbows on his desk and his fingers laced together, and he looked at Eliza's documentation with the expression of a man who had not expected to be handed documentation. "Mrs. Cross prepared all this?" he said. "I did," Eliza said. He looked at it for another moment. "You're saying the fire was deliberately set." "I'm saying the physical evidence is consistent with deliberate setting," Eliza said. "I'm not a fire investigator, but the oil spots along the north wall aren't consistent with accidental ignition, and the boot prints in the tree line aren't consistent with anyone who had a legitimate reason to be on the property." Pruitt looked at Gideon. "You have any idea who'd do this?" Gideon looked at him steadily. "Victor Harrow has been attempting to obtain our property for the past 2 months. He's made formal legal threats. We've declined to engage on his terms." Pruitt's expression shifted fractionally, in a way Gideon didn't entirely like. Something closing off behind his eyes, some calculation happening that he wasn't sharing. "Harrow's a significant man in this county," Pruitt said. "He is," Gideon agreed. "I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm telling you the context." Pruitt looked down at Eliza's notes again. "I'll ride out tomorrow and look at the site." "Today would be better," Eliza said. "The weather may change." Something flickered across Pruitt's face. Not quite irritation, but the expression of a man not accustomed to being pushed on timing by someone he hadn't expected to push. He looked at her for a moment. "I have other business this afternoon," he said. "I understand," she said, in a tone that communicated clearly that she found this disappointing, but was not surprised. "We'll preserve the site as best we can." Outside, walking back to the horses, Gideon said quietly, "He's not going to move fast." "No," she agreed. "He's not. Harrow has cultivated this county for years, and Pruitt knows which way the wind is blowing." She untied her horse with efficient, tight movements that told him she was angrier than she was showing. "That's fine. We don't need the sheriff to move fast. We need the evidence to be there when he finally does move, and we need it to say something he can't ignore." They rode back to the ranch. Thomas came out that evening, having heard from someone in town, and stood in the yard looking at the collapsed ruin of the barn, with his fists at his sides, and said nothing for a long time. "You're sure it was Harrow's men?" he said finally. "I'm not sure of anything yet," Eliza said, "but I'm going to be." Thomas looked at her. He was 16 and tired, and there was something in his face in that moment that Gideon recognized. The look of someone deciding whether to be frightened or angry, and landing on angry because it was more useful. "What do you need?" "Right now?" "Nothing. Go back to town, keep your head down, keep working." She put a hand on his arm briefly. "If you hear anything about who Harrow has been hiring lately, any new men in town, anyone who left quickly, let me know." Thomas nodded and rode back to town. The next 2 days, Gideon dealt with the practical aftermath, buying emergency feed from a rancher 12 miles north who had excess at a price that hurt, stacking it in the main barn, rearranging the space. It was expensive and exhausting, and the horses were agitated by the change in routine and the lingering smell of smoke. And by the end of the second day, he was short-tempered in a way he didn't like in himself. He came in for supper to find Eliza at the table with a piece of paper in her hand, reading it with an expression of intense concentration. "What is that?" he asked. "Response from the Helena Land Office." She looked up. "It came while you were out." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "And?" "They sent copies of every filing on record for this section of the valley." She turned the page toward him. There's no survey on record from the past 5 years that touches our boundary lines. Harrow's letter referenced a survey that, according to territorial records, does not exist. Gideon stared at the document. He invented it, he said. He invented it, she confirmed. Or he's planning to backdate something, which is a significantly more serious crime than a property dispute. She set the paper down. This, combined with the arson, if we can connect the arson to him, changes the nature of what we're dealing with. He's not just pressuring us. He's fabricating legal reality and using physical violence as a backup. She was quiet for a moment. That means he's done this before. You don't build that playbook from scratch. Gideon thought about the Albrights, the Mercers, families who'd sold up and left without explanation. What do we do with this? He asked, nodding at the Helena documents. We hold it, she said. For now. We don't show our hand until we have the arson tied to something concrete. Right now we have a fabricated survey claim and a burned barn, but no direct line connecting Harrow to the fire. She picked up her pencil. We need that line. 3 days later, Thomas came back. He arrived mid-morning, rode fast, and tied his horse at the post with the jerky movements of someone who'd been thinking about what they were carrying for most of the journey and was ready to put it down. There was a man, he said, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands. Showed up in Harlan about 6 weeks ago. Dole, people called him. Nobody knew where from, worked odd jobs at the livery for a while. He looked at Gideon and then at Eliza. He left town 3 days after your fire. Nobody's seen him since. Eliza was very still. The livery, she said. Who runs the livery? Amos Ketch. Does Amos Ketch talk to Harrow's men? Thomas considered. Harrow's outfit boards horses there when they're in town, so probably. Eliza looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. We need to talk to Amos Ketch, she said. He won't talk to us, Gideon said. Not if he thinks Harrow's paying attention. No, she agreed. She was quiet for a moment, turning the pencil in her fingers. But he might talk to someone who isn't us, someone whose name isn't Cross, who doesn't have a visible stake in the matter. She glanced at Thomas. Thomas straightened slightly. No, Gideon said immediately. He's just asking questions, Eliza said. Casual, as if he heard about the fire and is curious about this man Dole that people mentioned. Nobody pays attention to a boy asking questions. I'm not a boy, Thomas said, with dignity. You're 16, Gideon said. Which is why nobody'll think twice about me asking, Thomas said. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. He thought about telling Eliza this was not a thing he was comfortable with, putting the boy in the middle of this. He looked at her and could see she'd already had that argument with herself, had already weighed it, was waiting for him to arrive at the same conclusion she had. Casual, Gideon said to Thomas. You heard about the fire and someone mentioned Dole's name. You're just curious. You leave the moment it feels wrong. I know, Thomas said. He went to town the next morning. He came back that afternoon with something in his face that made them both stand up when they saw him ride into the yard. He came inside, sat down, and said, Amos Ketch said Dole came in the night before the fire and bought a half-gallon of lamp oil, paid cash. Said it was for his rooming house. Thomas looked at his sister steadily. Amos said the rooming house furnishes the lamps. He didn't think about it much at the time, but he remembered because it was late, past 9, and Dole paid in cash when he usually ran a tab. The room was quiet. The lamp oil, the boot prints, the man who'd appeared in town 6 weeks before the fire and vanished 3 days after it. Eliza set her pencil down on the table with a small, deliberate sound. That's the thread, she said. The thread, once they had it, needed to be pulled carefully. Eliza understood this in the way she understood most things. Not from instinct alone, but from thinking it through to its edges, finding where it could break, deciding how to hold it so it didn't. She sat at the table that evening with Thomas's information and Amos Ketch's account laid out in her head alongside everything else they had, and she mapped it the way she'd mapped the financial records in January, methodically, without rushing toward conclusions she wanted to be true before she'd earned them. What they had, a man named Dole, who appeared in Harlan with no clear origin, purchased lamp oil late at night the evening before the fire, and vanished 3 days after. Boot prints approaching the barn from the tree line. Oil spots along the north wall. A fabricated survey claim in Harrow's legal letter that the Helena Land Office had no record of. What they did not have. Anything that put Dole on Gideon's property that night. Anything that connected Dole to Harrow directly. Anything a territorial judge would look at and call evidence rather than suspicion. The lamp oil purchase is circumstantial, she said to Gideon, who was sitting across from her letting her think out loud, which she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't interrupt the process, didn't push toward conclusions before they were ready. Ketch will say what he saw, but a good lawyer argues that a man buying lamp oil is not a man starting fires. So we need the connection to Harrow, Gideon said. We need someone who can place Dole in Harrow's employ, someone who saw them together or who knows Harrow hired him. She drummed her pencil once on the table. The livery. Harrow's men board their horses with Ketch when they're in town. If Dole came through as one of Harrow's outfit even once, Ketch might know, Gideon finished. Or remember. Did Thomas ask him directly about Harrow? No, I told him casual. He didn't push. She nodded. That had been right. Pushing Ketch too hard too soon would have closed him down. But now they needed more from him, which meant someone Ketch would talk to. Really talk to. Not just answer quick questions from a 16-year-old running errands. I need to speak to him myself, she said. Gideon's expression shifted. If Harrow has people paying attention to what we do, I won't go as your wife asking questions about a fire on your property. She looked at him. I'll go as Margaret Rowan's daughter, who's in town on household business and happens to stop at the livery to ask about boarding the mare for a day. She paused. People talk differently when they don't feel like they're being questioned. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the objection, the risk of it, the fact that she'd be alone in town with whatever eyes Harrow had there, and deciding that she was right about the approach even if he didn't love it. I'll come with you, he said. I'll go to the hardware store while you're at the livery. We're just in town for supplies. She agreed. It was a reasonable compromise, and she'd learned by now that Gideon's reasonable compromises were worth taking. They went to Harland the following morning. The town had that gray end-of-winter look. Dirty snow piled against the storefronts, the sky the color of old chalk, everyone moving with the particular purposefulness of people who have been cold for a long time and intend to stay cold for at least another month and are managing their feelings about that privately. Gideon went left toward the hardware store. Eliza took the mare to the livery. Amos Ketch was a small, compact man of about 50, with hands that looked too large for his body, built up from years of working horses. He came out of the back when he heard her come in and nodded at her with the neutral courtesy of a man who recognized her without knowing her well. Mrs. Cross, he said. Boarding the mare? For a few hours, she said. We're in town for the day. He took the horse with practiced efficiency. She watched him check the animal's feet out of habit before he led her to a stall, the same automatic check she did herself, and said, She favors her left fore a little. He glanced back. You've got a good eye. My father kept horses. She leaned against the stall rail the way someone does when they're in no hurry and have nothing particular on their mind. I heard you had some trouble here last month. Someone said there was a man, Dole, who boarded here and then left suddenly. Ketch moved to the water bucket and checked the level. His hands were steady. People come and go. They do, she agreed. She let a moment pass. Did he board horses here? Dole? Ketch was quiet for a beat longer than the question deserved. He came in a few times, took care of horses that weren't his own, grooming, watering. I assumed he was working for someone. For Harrow's outfit? He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she'd come in. She held his gaze without any particular pressure, just waiting. I don't want trouble, he said. I know, she said. Neither do I. Neither does my husband. She kept her voice level, no urgency in it. I'm not asking you to testify in court right now, Mr. Ketch. I'm asking if you know. He looked at the horse. He was doing the same calculation she'd seen on Thomas's face, on Sheriff Pruitt's face, on the faces of every person in the valley who had a Victor Harrow-shaped problem in their peripheral vision and had been carefully not looking directly at it for years. He came in twice with one of Harrow's regular men, Ketch said finally, still looking at the horse. A rider named Fell. Fell boards a gray gelding here when he's in town. He paused. They weren't exactly friendly with each other, but they rode in together, both times. Eliza breathed. Thank you, she said. Just that. She collected the mare 4 hours later, paid for the boarding, and rode to where Gideon was waiting at the edge of town. She told him what Ketch had said on the ride home, keeping her voice even, watching his face as the pieces connected. "Fell," he said. "I know that name. Harrow's man. He's been at the land office in Harlan twice in the past year. From what I heard, we need to find Dole," she said. "Or find enough about him that the connection to Harrow is clear without needing Dole to say it himself." That night she wrote 3 letters. One to a lawyer named Aldous Grant in Helena, whose name she'd found in the land office correspondence as someone who handled territorial property cases. One to a contact of her father's in Billings, a man she'd never met but who her father had described as someone who knew how to find information through channels that weren't obvious. And one to Sheriff Pruitt, formally requesting an update on the investigation and noting, precisely and without editorializing, that new information had come to light regarding a man named Dole who had purchased lamp oil the night before the fire and had since left town. She signed her name to all 3. Gideon read them before she sealed them. He handed the last one back and said, "He's going to know we're pushing." "Yes," she said. "That's partly the point. Pruitt needs to feel like sitting still is more uncomfortable than moving." The next week was the worst kind of waiting. The kind where you've done what you can do and the outcome is in someone else's hands, and all you can do is keep working and not let the anxiety eat through the work. They rebuilt the feed situation, spending money that hurt. Gideon repaired the remaining structures around the barn site. Eliza wrote to the Helena land office a second time, requesting clarification on the process for flagging a falsified survey claim, and received a response that was encouraging without committing to anything specific. It was Thomas again who brought the first real break. He came out on a Sunday, 2 weeks after Eliza's letter to Pruitt, with the information delivered in the careful, measured way he'd started presenting things. He'd grown up noticeably in the past 2 months, not just physically, but in the particular way that people grow when they've been trusted with something real. "Dole's in Billings," he said. "Or was. A man at the mill has a cousin there who knows someone at the rail yard. Dole's been working there for about 3 weeks, under his own name, which is either stupid or he doesn't think anyone's looking." Eliza looked at Gideon. "If Aldous Grant can reach Billings contacts," she started. "I'll ride to Helena," Gideon said. She blinked. "You want to go yourself?" "I want someone who knows this property and this situation to put it in front of a lawyer in person. Not on paper." He looked at her steadily. "Paper can be dismissed. A man in the room is harder to dismiss." She couldn't argue with that. She spent the evening helping him prepare, organizing the documentation she'd assembled over the past 2 months into a clear sequence, writing a 3-page summary of the legal situation and the arson evidence in her precise hand, making sure everything was labeled and cross-referenced in a way that any competent lawyer could follow without needing to ask 20 questions first. He left before dawn. She stood in the yard and watched him go, the horse's breath clouding in the cold air, Gideon's back straight in the saddle the way it always was. And she had the particular feeling of someone who had become accustomed to another person's presence, realizing suddenly and without warning how much space that person had started to occupy. She went inside and got to work. The 3 days Gideon was gone were productive. She finished the summary of the fraudulent survey claim, cross-referencing it against the Helena Land Office response with page numbers. She wrote up the arson evidence in formal language, organized chronologically. She drafted a timeline of Harrow's actions from the first letter through the barn fire, with every supporting document cited. She also slept badly and ate less than she should have and was short-tempered with the chickens, which was unfair to the chickens, and she knew it. Gideon came back on the 3rd evening, later than she expected, and she was in the barn doing the final feeding when she heard the horse. She came out of the barn door with a lantern, and he was already dismounting, and she read his face in the lamplight. Tired, road-worn, but something there that hadn't been there when he left. "Grant will take the case," he said. She let out a breath. It came out shakier than she intended. "And Dole?" she said. "Grant has contacts in Billings. Legal contacts. A marshal's deputy he works with. If Dole's there, they can find him." He tied the horse and looked at her. "Grant thinks that if we can get Dole's account, even partial, even him confirming Harrow's man fell, hired him for work he won't specify. Combined with the false survey documentation, we have grounds for a territorial investigation." "Not just the property dispute," she said. "Not just the property dispute." He looked at her for a moment. Grant said the false survey alone, if we can demonstrate it was presented as real to pressure a property owner, is fraud under territorial statute. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal. The word sat in the cold air between them. Criminal. Not a property dispute. Not a legal gray area where Harrow's money could outmaneuver their documentation. Criminal exposure, the kind that followed a man into rooms his money usually protected him from. He didn't know we had the Helena documentation, she said, when he sent that letter referencing the survey. He thought we'd either panic or try to argue the legal details without being able to prove the survey didn't exist. That's what Grant said. Gideon started unsaddling the horse, his movements efficient, the habitual competence of someone doing a familiar thing while his mind was somewhere else. He assumed we didn't know how to look. She picked up the brush and started working the horse's other side without being asked, the way they'd fallen into working together over the past months. The division not planned, just the natural result of two people who paid attention to what needed doing. How long? She asked. Grant thinks 4 to 6 weeks to get the Billings contact moving and have something to present to a territorial official. He glanced at her over the horse's back. He said in the meantime, Harrow may escalate. If he senses the pressure, he might try something else before the legal process closes around him. Then we make sure the legal process closes fast, she said. He nodded. They finished with the horse and walked back to the house together in the cold, and she made supper while he cleaned up from the road, and they ate and talked through what came next with the focused practicality that had become their language. Not emotional, not dramatic, just two people working a problem from both ends until they met in the middle. It was after supper, when the dishes were cleared and the fire had settled into its evening rhythm, and she was reviewing the timeline document one more time, that Gideon said from across the table, "You know what Grant said when I showed him your summary?" She looked up. He said he wished more of his clients came in with documentation like this, said it made his job half as hard as usual. Gideon looked at her steadily. He asked who prepared it. I told him my wife. She looked at him for a moment. The fire moved. What did he say to that? She asked. He said you'd have made a good lawyer. She turned back to the document. There was something in her chest that she didn't examine closely, something warm and complicated that she was fairly sure she wasn't ready to look at directly. Tell him I'd have been a better one than half the ones I've read, she said. Gideon made a sound that was the closest he came to laughing. Sheriff Pruitt came to the property 5 days later, finally, with a deputy. He walked the north wall site, looked at what was left of the oil spot evidence, degraded now by weather, but still partially visible, and listened while Gideon told him about Dole and Amos Ketch's account and the connection to Fell. Pruitt listened with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, and when Gideon finished, Pruitt looked at the burned-out barn site for a long moment. Fell's worked for Harrow for 6 years, he said. I know, Gideon said. Another silence. I'll look into Dole's whereabouts, Pruitt said finally. It was a small capitulation, barely visible, but it was there. The letter from Eliza, the formal request with the specific details, had done its work. Pruitt understood now that if he continued to do nothing while a documented investigation proceeded through territorial channels, the question of his own inaction would eventually come up in a room he'd rather not be in. We appreciate that, Gideon said. After Pruitt left, Eliza stood on the porch and watched the sheriff's horses disappear down the wagon road. She had her coat pulled around her, arms crossed against the cold, and there was something on her face that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't relief. Something more like the feeling of watching a machine start that you'd spent a long time figuring out how to operate. She thought about her father, who had understood money without being able to manage it. She thought about the 2 years of debt and laundry and her brother's worn hands and her mother's tired face. She thought about arriving at this property on a cold morning with a mended coat and no real plan, except that it was better than the alternative. She had not planned for any of this. Not for a burned barn, or a mining baron, or a falsified survey, or a trip to Helena. She had planned for a practical arrangement with a quiet widower and an honest winter's work. She had not planned for the way it felt to stand on this porch and feel like it was hers to defend. She went back inside. The letter from Aldous Grant confirming that his Billings contact had located Dole was sitting on the table. It had arrived the previous afternoon, a single page in a lawyer's compressed professional handwriting. Dole was in Billings. He was working at the rail yard under his own name. And according to Grant's contact, he had, when approached by a deputy and offered the difference between cooperation and obstruction, been talking. What Dole said filled 2 pages that Grant had summarized at the bottom of his letter in plain language. Fell hired him. Fell paid him $50 to travel to the valley, learn the layout of a specific property, and destroy the hay barn in a way that looked like accident or bad luck. Fell had told him the owner was going to sell soon anyway, and the fire was just moving things along. Fell had given him the lamp oil money out of his own pocket, in cash, the afternoon before the fire. And Fell, according to 2 witnesses Grant's contact had located, had met twice with Victor Harrow in the week before Dole arrived in Harlan. Eliza picked up the letter and read it again, though she'd already read it 3 times. Not because she didn't believe it, because she wanted to feel the full weight of it, what it meant, what it opened, what it was finally going to cost Victor Harrow. Then she set it down, picked up her pencil, and began drafting the next letter to the Territorial Land Office, this time referencing the criminal evidence in Grant's hands and formally requesting the opening of a fraud investigation into the boundary survey presented by agents representing Victor Harrow's mining interests. She wrote cleanly, without flourish, every sentence doing exactly the work it needed to do. Outside, the first week of March had brought a shift in the air, not warm yet, nothing as generous as that, but something different than February's grinding cold. A suggestion, nothing more. The particular quality of light in the afternoon that changed just enough to remind you the season was not permanent, that the land had been here before the snow and would be here after. The creek ran under its ice, patient, neither knowing nor caring about the men and women arguing over its ownership above. But the argument was almost over. And for the first time since December, Eliza believed that with something more than determination. She believed it with evidence. The territorial investigator arrived in Harlan on a Thursday in the second week of March, and he did not come alone. His name was Harlan Voss, which caused mild confusion at the post office given the town's name, a coincidence he appeared accustomed to. And he came with 2 deputies and a document case that he carried himself, which told Eliza something about what was in it. Men who trusted their documents to others were men whose documents were ordinary. Voss kept his close. She knew he'd arrived because Thomas rode out that same afternoon, arriving at the ranch slightly out of breath from pushing the horse harder than necessary, with the news delivered in the terse, efficient way he'd developed over the past months of being their best source of information in town. He went to Pruitt first, Thomas said, then to the land office. He was there for 2 hours. Gideon looked at Eliza. Grant's letter said Voss would want to speak with us directly, she said. He'll come out here or send for us. Voss sent word the following morning. A formal note, courteous, requesting that Mr. and Mrs. Cross come to Harlan at their convenience to provide a statement, and noting that their documentation had been received and reviewed. Their documentation. She'd wondered if it would get that far, if the letters to the land office, the carefully assembled timeline, the cross-referenced evidence would survive the distance between a ranch kitchen table and a territorial investigator's desk intact and legible. Apparently it had. They rode in together. The town had a different quality that morning. People moving with the particular awareness of a community that senses something significant is happening inside it, but hasn't been told what. 2 strangers' horses outside Pruitt's office, men who usually lingered talking outside the general store moving on without lingering. The specific quiet of a place where information is traveling faster underground than above it. Voss met them in a room at the back of the land office that usually held survey maps and old filing boxes. He was perhaps 50, lean, with the unhurried manner of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that rushing produced mistakes. He shook Gideon's hand, nodded to Eliza, and gestured to the 2 chairs across the table from him. Mrs. Cross, he said, as they settled, I want you to know that the documentation you compiled was among the clearest I've received in 12 years doing this work. He said it without flattery, in the tone of a professional noting a fact. It made the picture considerably easier to assemble. Thank you, she said. I have some questions about the sequence of the survey claim, specifically when you first received Harrow's letter and what steps you took to verify the survey's existence. He opened his document case. Walk me through it from the beginning. She walked him through it. All of it. The first letter in January, the response they drafted, the decision to contact the Helena land office. the response confirming no such survey existed. She spoke clearly and without editorializing, the same way she'd learned to write the documents. Let the facts make the argument. Don't dress them up. Trust that the truth is more persuasive than the telling of it. Gideon added the details about the arson, the boot prints, Amos Ketch's account of the lamp oil purchase, Thomas's information about Dole, and the connection to Fell. He was precise and sparing with words, which Voss seemed to appreciate. At the end, Voss made a note, looked at it, and said, Fell has already been brought in for questioning in Billings. He declined to speak initially. When shown the documentation of Dole's statement, he reconsidered. He looked up at them. He's confirmed that he hired Dole at Victor Harrow's direction. The instruction was specific. Destroy the hay barn, make it look like accident, and if the crosses didn't sell within the month following, he was to come back to Harrow for further instructions. The room was quiet for a moment. Further instructions, Gideon said. Yes. Voss's expression didn't change. We don't know what those would have been. Fell says he wasn't told in advance. He was to report back. He looked at his notes. We have Fell's account, Dole's account, and the documentary evidence of the fraudulent survey claim. Harrow has been formally notified that a territorial investigation has been opened. His lawyer has already been in contact with our office. What happens now? Eliza asked. That depends partly on what Harrow chooses to do. Voss closed the document case. Men in his position sometimes fight. Sometimes, when they understand the weight of what they're facing, they make a different calculation. He looked at them evenly. The fraudulent survey constitutes criminal fraud under territorial statute. The arson, as a directed action, makes him liable for the consequences. His lawyer understands this. Whether Harrow does yet is a separate question. They rode home with that information sitting between them on the road, the horses moving steadily through mud that was beginning to replace the frozen ground, the first real sign of the season shifting. He might still fight it, Gideon said. He might, Eliza agreed. And if he does? She thought about it. The long months of winter, the burned barn, the money spent on emergency feed, the nights she'd lain awake with the documents spread in her head, finding the next thread, the next step, the next angle. She thought about what Voss had said, the clearest documentation I've received in 12 years, and what that meant about all the cases before theirs where the documentation had been less clear, where people without her particular set of skills and her father's particular education had faced the same machine and lost to it. Then we keep fighting, she said, but I don't think he will. Men like Harrow choose their battles based on whether they can win them. He didn't expect us to know how to look. He thought the false survey would send you to the table in a panic, and when it didn't, he thought the fire would. She looked at the road ahead. He made 2 calculations about what we were, and he was wrong about both of them. He'll adjust. She was right, though the adjustment took another 3 weeks and came through lawyers rather than directly. Harrow's attorney contacted Aldous Grant in mid-March with a proposal. Harrow would withdraw all legal claims against the Cross property, formally acknowledge the boundary lines as originally filed, and pay restitution for the barn damage. In exchange, the territorial fraud investigation would be resolved through civil rather than criminal proceedings, meaning fines and penalties rather than prosecution. Grant sent them a letter asking for their decision. Gideon read it at the table and handed it to Eliza. She read it twice and set it down. It protects him from prosecution, she said. Yes, and it resolves everything else completely. Yes. He looked at her. What do you think? She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the Albrights, the Mercers, the families who'd left without explanation, without documentation, without anyone putting the pieces together because they hadn't known to look, or hadn't had the tools, or had simply been too exhausted by the fight to keep going. Harrow had done this before. The arrangement on the table would stop him from doing it to them. It would not stop him from doing it to someone else. I think, she said carefully, that we should ask Grant whether the civil resolution prevents a separate criminal referral for the previous instances, the families before us. She looked at Gideon. If it doesn't, if the civil resolution only covers our case, then I want Grant to make clear in the response that we reserve the right to cooperate with any future investigation of Harrow's practices in this valley. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of something in her that he hadn't fully seen the dimensions of until now. That's not in our direct interest, he said, pushing that. It complicates the resolution. I know, she said, but those other families are gone and somebody pushed them out, and nobody ever connected the pieces because nobody had the information organized in a way that made the picture clear. She held his gaze. We have the information. We have it organized. If there's ever another investigation, we can make sure it's available. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Write it the way you want it, and we'll send it to Grant. Grant came back 2 weeks later with confirmation. The civil resolution covered only the cross-property matter. Any separate investigation arising from other complaints was a separate legal matter to which the resolution did not apply. And he'd taken the liberty, with their approval, of noting to the territorial office that the Crosses were willing to cooperate with any such inquiry should one arise. They signed the resolution documents in early April in Grant's office in Helena, where they'd ridden together on roads that were finally reluctantly releasing the winter. Mud and standing water and patches of bare brown ground where the snow had pulled back from the slopes like a tide going out. Victor Harrow's formal withdrawal of all claims against the Cross property was filed on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, according to Thomas, it was the only thing anyone in Harlan wanted to talk about. By Thursday, Pruitt had stopped Gideon on the street and shaken his hand with the particular vigor of a man trying to communicate more apology than the gesture could hold, and Gideon had accepted it without comment because there was nothing useful to say about it. The barn they rebuilt in April and May, when the ground was workable. It was not fast or easy. Construction never was. And they were doing it with their own hands and one hired hand named Pete, a quiet man of 60 who knew timber and did not offer opinions about things outside of timber, which made him excellent company. The new barn was better than the old one. Eliza had drawn up a rough plan before they started, based on the conversation she'd had with Gideon about what didn't work in the original layout. The angle of the hay storage relative to the door, the ventilation in the back stalls. She'd sketched it at the kitchen table one evening in February during the worst of the waiting because she needed to be building something in her head even when she couldn't build anything with her hands. Gideon had looked at the sketch and made 2 suggestions and left everything else as she'd drawn it. The structure that went up in April was stronger than what had burned, with better airflow and a wider door and the hay storage positioned the way she'd planned it. Pete looked at the finished frame on the last day and said it was solid work, and then went home without additional ceremony, and Gideon and Eliza stood in the empty barn in the late afternoon light and looked at what they'd built. It's better, she said. It is, he agreed. She looked at the new boards, pale and clean, still smelling of cut pine. She thought of the burned boards, the smoke, that terrible night in February standing in the cold with buckets while the fire took what it wanted. She thought about standing in the yard afterward, not crying, because there had been too much to do, and crying was something she'd learned to schedule for when she could afford it. She had cried eventually. Once, in her room, with the door closed, sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. Not for long, but she had, and it had been necessary, and she hadn't told anyone, and she didn't intend to. Eliza. She looked at him. He was still looking at the new barn walls, not at her, which for some reason made what he said next easier to hear. I owe you something I haven't said. He was quiet for a moment, working on it. When you came here, I thought the best I could do was be fair to you, give you a decent situation in exchange for help with the work. That seemed like the honest version of the arrangement. He paused. I didn't expect it to be more than that. She watched him. And I don't quite know when it became more than that, he said, and now he did look at her with the directness he'd always had, but something different behind it now, something that wasn't the careful reserve she'd been reading for months. But it did. Somewhere between the ledgers and the fence post and the letters to Helena and the night of the fire. It became more than that. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing she'd been careful not to examine too closely for months. The warmth she'd felt in late February watching him ride away to Helena. The way the house had felt different and slightly wrong for the 3 days he was gone. The particular quality of relief when she'd seen him ride back in. She'd filed it under practical dependency. Of course it mattered that he was there. They were building something together and it couldn't be built alone. That had been her explanation, and she'd found it sufficient. She did not find it sufficient anymore. It's not the same thing as what you had with Clara, she said. Not as a question and not as reassurance. Just as something that needed to be said, clearly. No, he agreed. It isn't. That was 20 years of knowing someone. That was built out of time I don't have any way to give you back. He looked at her steadily. But this is built out of something real, too. I know that. I know you, Eliza. Not everything. I don't suppose I know everything, and I think that probably takes longer than 6 months, but enough. She thought about what she'd told Thomas back in the worst of February, when he'd stood in the yard looking at the burned barn with his fists clenched. I haven't come this far to hand anything to a man like Victor Harrow. She'd meant the land. She'd meant the creek and the 320 acres and the water rights explicitly included in the original filing. She understood now that she'd also meant this particular morning, in this particular new barn with this particular man who had offered her a fair arrangement and had been surprised, she suspected, to find that she was more than what the arrangement required. She was more than what most arrangements required. That had been both her problem and her only real asset for most of her life. I chose to stay, she said, not because I had nowhere else to go. She held his gaze. I had places I could have gone. I stayed because this was where I wanted to be. He took a slow breath, like something had been wound tight in his chest for a long time and had just been allowed to release. They did not make a dramatic scene of it. They were not people who made dramatic scenes. He put his hand on the side of her face and she let him, and what passed between them was quiet and certain in the way of two people who have already proven something to each other through a winter's worth of harder tests than this. Spring came fully in May. The fields they'd planned through the winter months went into the ground in proper order, the south quarter planted exactly as they'd mapped it, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt, entirely and irrefutably theirs. Gideon's knee hurt when the weather changed, and he managed it without complaint, and Eliza made him a compress from something she'd read about in one of her not appropriate for her books, and it helped more than he expected, and he thanked her without making a thing of it. The harvest that autumn was better than anything the ranch had produced in 3 years. Not miraculously better. The soil was the soil, the weather was the weather, and farming was fundamentally a negotiation with both that no amount of good planning entirely controlled. But the South Quarter produced at the level Gideon had always believed it could, with the water managed the way Eliza had suggested, and the planting time the way they'd worked out together over the winter. Some of that harvest they sold. Some they kept. A portion went to 2 families in the valley who'd had a bad season through circumstances that had nothing to do with Victor Harrow. Just weather and a sick animal at the wrong moment, and the ordinary punishing difficulty of building something in unforgiving country. Gideon brought the food over himself and didn't say much about it, and the families didn't make much of it either, which was the right way to handle it. Thomas turned 17 in September and came out to the ranch for his birthday and ate supper and helped Gideon repair a section of the east fence in the afternoon and looked at the property with the eyes of someone seeing it clearly for the first time, not as the place his sister had gone when she had no better options, but as something built and defended and made real through a particular combination of work and stubbornness and the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. "She's different," he said to Gideon while they were working the fence, his voice low the way it got when he was being careful with something. "Your sister?" "Yeah." He worked the wire without looking up. "Not bad different, just she was always capable, but now she looks like she knows it." Gideon drove the staple home and didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the woman who'd arrived in his yard in December with a mended coat and eyes that dared him to turn her away, and the woman who'd stood in the Helena land office in April watching an investigator file documents that represented the end of Victor Harrow's hold on this valley. Same woman, different knowledge of herself. "She was always capable," he agreed. "I just gave her somewhere to point it." Thomas looked at him, the way he sometimes looked at Gideon now, not with the hostile assessment of that first meeting in the yard, but with the particular complicated respect of a young man toward someone who has demonstrated that he takes the people who matter to him seriously. "That's a decent thing," Thomas said. "She'd say she pointed herself," Gideon said. Thomas almost smiled. "Yeah, she would." Margaret Rowan came to visit in October, brought by Thomas on a clear autumn day when the valley was the particular gold and rust that Montana managed for about 3 weeks before the cold came back and ended it. She was a compact woman with Eliza's eyes and Thomas's jaw, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been managing too much for too long, and was only now beginning to believe she might be allowed to stop. She walked through the house with the careful attention of someone checking whether her daughter was truly all right or just claiming to be, which Eliza accepted without comment because she understood it was love expressing itself in the only language her mother had. In the kitchen, while Gideon and Thomas were out looking at the new barn, Margaret stood at the window and looked at the south fields and said quietly, "I sent you here because I was desperate and I didn't know what else to do." "I know," Eliza said. "I worried about it for months." She turned from the window. "Whether it was fair to you, whether I'd put you in a bad situation and called it a solution because I needed it to be one." Eliza looked at her mother. She thought about the right answer. The one that would reassure, the one that would close the worry off cleanly. She decided on the true one instead. "It wasn't fair," she said. "You made a decision for me because you were frightened, and it wasn't fair." She held her mother's gaze. "And it was also the thing that led me here, to this specific place which turned out to be where I needed to be. Both of those things are true at the same time." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. "You sound like your father," she said. "I know," Eliza said. "That's probably not always going to be a comfortable thing." Her mother laughed. A real one, short and surprised, the kind that comes out before a person decides whether they meant to laugh. And then she pulled Eliza in and held her for a long moment, the way she hadn't since Eliza was much younger, since before the debts and the death and the years of managing. Eliza held on. Victor Harrow, through the autumn and into the following year, faced the consequences of the fraud case through the civil proceedings that had been agreed upon. His mining operations continued. Money insulated him from ruin, even when it couldn't insulate him from penalty. But the territorial investigation, once opened, uncovered enough about his history in the valley that two other families eventually came forward. The Albrights, not the Mercers, who'd moved too far and couldn't easily return, but their son, who still lived in the territory and had his parents' account of what had happened. Eliza provided her documentation to the territorial office as she'd told Gideon she would. She did it quietly, without announcement, because it wasn't something she needed credit for. Harrow did not go to prison. That was the honest ending, the real one. Men with his money rarely did, and pretending otherwise would have been a different kind of story than this one. But he paid. He paid in fines and in reputation and in the particular loss of standing that comes when a community understands, all at once, what a man has been doing behind the face he showed them. When people in Harlan spoke of him now, there was a different quality in how his name was said. It wasn't justice in the clean, complete sense. Eliza understood that. Real life rarely produced clean, complete justice. It produced partial reckonings and accumulated weight, and the slow, grinding result of people deciding that enough was enough and being willing to do the difficult, specific work of proving it. She could live with partial. She had built more than she expected from less. In the last weeks of that first October, after the harvest was in and the barn was full and the accounts were in their best shape since Gideon had arrived in this valley 12 years before, he came in from the fields one evening to find her at the table, not with documents, not with ledgers, but with one of her inappropriate novels open in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, reading with the same total absorption she brought to everything. She didn't look up when he came in. He didn't announce himself. He washed his hands at the basin, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from her. After a moment, she said, still reading, "The south field came in better than I expected." "It did," he said. "The soil on the east edge is still thin." She turned a page. "We should work more organic material into it over winter." I was thinking the same thing. She looked up then, over the top of the book, with the particular expression she had when something was occurring to her that she was deciding whether to say. She decided to say it. "I'm happy," she said. Just that. Matter of fact, without decoration, the way she'd first told him about her family's debts at this same table on a cold December morning. Just a fact laid down between them. "I thought you should know." He looked at her. He thought about the rotted fence post, the 11 days of silence before she appeared at his door, the ledgers he'd been avoiding and the cracked window stuffed with rags, and the nights he'd talked to the horses just to hear his own voice make words. He thought about everything that had been built in this house since December. Not just the barn, not just the case against Harrow, but the harder, quieter construction of two people learning to trust their weight to something new. "Good," he said. She went back to her book. He drank his coffee. The fire held. Outside, the last of October's golden light was pulling back from the fields, the day ending the way the good ones did. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just settling into dark and quiet, and the particular piece of a place where the work has been done, and done well. And everyone inside is where they meant to be. The creek ran south through the lower fields, cold and clear and entirely theirs, the way it had always been and would remain. Neither of them talked about the future that night. They'd both learned across a hard winter that the future was built from what you did today, and what you did today was built from who you were willing to be under pressure, and that was not a thing you could plan for in advance. You could only show up, do the work, hold the line, and trust, not blindly, not naively, but with the earned and specific trust of people who had seen each other at their most capable and their most exhausted and their most uncertain. Trust that you had found someone worth holding the line beside. That was enough. That had always been enough.